to be sharing with you all, but I'm excited to be here and to think of this as really being in conversation with the incredible scholarship that so many of you do, and to be part of this broader conversation. I'm going to share my screen. Let's make sure. Can everyone see that? Excellent. Okay. So, one of the things I was asked to do this morning is to address the policy context that create enabling conditions for school-based equity-focused change, and to think about what do policymakers need to know that they don't know. So I want to start by being very upfront. After 10 years as an educator and a community-based organizational leader, when I decided to go back to grad school, I was very clear that I was not interested in policy. Some of my classmates wanted to make a bigger impact as policymakers or researchers who could impact policy, but not me. I wanted to know how regular people can make change and contribute to vibrant, equitable education for all people. So to me, policy had nothing to do with that. So there's a certain irony that I'm sharing with you today. But I wanted to draw on this notion of cultivating soil and really think about, what does it mean to cultivate the soils of change? What does it mean to cultivate the kinds of fertile grounds that we might need for change on the kind of change that is happening on the ground? And, as we heard Kevin was talking about this morning, just really recognizing and acknowledging that there's so much going on in the world right now. There's so much happening that's coming at us that we are trying to often positioned to react to. And so one of the things I really appreciate about this invitation was a chance to think in a proactive way about what it might take to actually create these fertile grounds. So I wanted to start with this image here because I'm zooming in today from the lands of the Duwamish, the Puyallup, the Suquamish, the Tulalip, and the Muckleshoot peoples. And they have been and continue to steward, teach, learn, and lead on these lands since time immemorial. And I say that because not just because we have to do, land acknowledgements. The land acknowledgements often end up being kind of empty lip service. But this is actually an image that reminds me that policy can be this lever of change in educational systems, and then especially when all of these things are happening that are quashing equitable change at these broader systems levels, it's easy to lose track of the local and sometimes state level, depending on what state you live in, efforts that are actually creating levers for change. So since time immemorial is the name of the tribal sovereignty educational policy that has been around for nearly a decade here in Washington. And I'm a mom of 3 kids. And my 5th grade, this is the first time it's shown up in their curriculum in their homework. My 5th grader just learned about the Puyallup name for this mountain, which is Mount Tahoma, and settlers turned it into Mount Rainier. And this tribal curriculum is now required for all Washington state schools. And some of the federal guidance also is coming down. The districts who receive these Title VII funds must develop meaningful tribal consultation to foster informed policies and programs for Native students. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. So it's clear that policy can be a lever for change, but we also all know that my cynicism as a student wasn't unfounded. It doesn't take a PhD. We don't need to read all the research literature because kids and families on the ground, especially from communities of color, narrate these harms all the time, whether it's from educator turnover, school closures, didactic instruction, push out from disproportionate discipline. And one of the things that these reforms and many others have in common is that they were created and implemented by folks who are very far from the realities of everyday schools and communities, especially Black, Indigenous, Latina, Asian American, and Pacific Islander youth and families, who are the ones who are often disproportionately impacted by these policies. And that doesn't, of course, even mention the kind of backlash moment we're experiencing right now of anti-equity policies, book bans, anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, policy in many states, and of course also things like this summer's anti-affirmative action ruling. But I think even in the case of very promising equity policies, like we might point to the LCFF in California, the local control funding formula, and then in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, many districts across the country have passed racial equity policies. And a lot of these policies were advocated for and won by communities. But one of the things that we see is that the implementation typically defaults to districts and schools and administrators. So why does even equity center policy often accomplish, not realize its aims? So Dr. Megan Bang, as many of you know, and I have been collaborating for a number of years. And one of the things that we have drawn on Cheryl Harris's work on whiteness as property in tandem with understanding of settler colonialism to really illuminate this set of rarely examined assumptions that we refer to as the settled expectations of schooling. And this is a representation I share a lot with, especially practitioners. Because these assumptions are so baked in, it's difficult sometimes for people to see them, where schools and systems are at the center of these broader ecosystems of communities. And that may seem right to a lot of folks when they see this. I've said, of course, schools should be at the center of communities, and it's the premise of community schools. But part of what we're trying to illuminate here is also that the agendas are set by schools. They are system-centered agendas, and that this can be seen within systems, within classrooms. So, for example, things like social emotional learning or health and well-being are positioned as vehicles for other outcomes, for achievement outcomes. Parents' jobs in particular are implicated in these settled expectations. Their job is to get kids to school, to ensure they comply with homework, with school rules, to fundraise for the school's agenda. We have a very individualistic, narrow conception of families that dominate, and any departures from this kind of white heteropatriarchal normativity are constructed and seen through a deficit lens. So these settled expectations get realized through a set of racialized institutional scripts. And as many of us know and see on both every day and in our research, these scripts really do things like centering systems agendas. They equate degrees and job titles with expertise, solely those things, degrees and job titles. Only certain kinds of activities are seen as effective or successful, and that gets measured by test scores. And a lot of these scripts operate in such a way that they kind of presume that policy making, implementation, everyday interactions are somehow power and race neutral, when in fact they infuse decision making in education. And this kind of current onslaught of anti-equity and anti-DEI policies and politics take this even further. So one of the things that I tell people a lot is that these scripts are never absolute. We can rewrite them. And across my work with educators, administrators, families, youth, and many different studies, I have identified these 4 principles to reshape practice. I'm a former science teacher and environmental justice organizer as well. So I think a lot about, well, you know, the science teacher in me, I always say, like, the middle school science teacher in me dies hard. So I think about, I started to think about policy conditions as soil. So we might think about, if these are some principles to shape practice on the ground, what makes conducive soil for growing these practice? How could and should we cultivate the soil for change on the ground? So I'm going to take up each one of these in terms of what policymakers need to know that they may not currently know, the kinds of policy contexts that might offer more fertile grounds for realizing these practices, and then offer a couple of examples. So I'm going to start with beginning with families and communities. So even when not mandated in policy, community engagement is often considered an obligatory best practice of democratic governance. But what seems like neutral, all-inclusive invitations to participate are actually conventional approaches that enable opportunity hoarding. And so the corollary of that is that the racially minoritized youth, families, and communities who are impacted by injustices and who often bear the disproportionate burden of policies are positioned as victims in need of help or fixing, or merely passive beneficiaries. And so one of the things that I've been trying to work on with many other folks is just this notion that racially minoritized youth, families, and communities hold knowledge, practices, and lived experiences that we need if we are going to actually change our schools and produce more just schools. And Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley put this very succinctly. Those closest to the pain should be the closest to the power, driving and informing policymaking. What does it mean? How do we do that? What are the policy contexts, and what are the kinds of possibilities for doing that? And so we have a number of mechanisms that are kind of the fallback mechanisms. We have hearings, testimony, committees, and even more recently, listening sessions. And these old mechanisms not only tend to limit the influence of Black and Brown folks, they actually privilege and amplify the voices and influence of white privileged individuals. So those folks don't need additional platforms. They have influence even when they're outnumbered or not present. So one of the ideas that that can kind of contribute to growing a different kind of practice is crafting policies that build Black and Brown influential presence. This comes from my friend and colleague, Dr. Dakota Irby, who's written a book called Stuck Improving. And he defines Black and Brown influential presence as the integration, or the combined physical presence and integration of experiences, culture, and ways of being into the fabric of the organization, which is evidenced when people of color's priorities and ways of being reshape power structures in schools. So it means not simply naming parents in general, or choice, advocating for choice. As we all know, those are kind of political mechanisms that function to undermine public education and funding, and to empower individualistic choice from predetermined set of neoliberal options. So it instead implicates things like hiring processes, decision-making policies and processes, curricular policies, all building towards that influential presence. One of the things that this means and is different from is a kind of representational logic. And I always kind of refer to this as like the old McDonald had a farm kind of approach, because there's a tendency to want to say we need one of each kind of stakeholder group. And so one of the distinctions is that people can be represented, but not influential. And individuals can be tokenized and by just having a single person. And we all know that any group isn't monolithic, no matter how homogenous you think that it is. So instead, we might think about how we focus on the groups and communities that, as Michelle Fine says, those who experience injustices have specific revealing wisdom about unjust structural conditions. And what I want to add to that is just to recognize also that young people, families, and communities are also not solely their trauma. They also collectively carry non-dominant practices and knowledge that they can bring to decision-making and to solutions. So I'm going to give a quick example of this and some of the work that I've been doing. Megan and I and other members of FLDVC have been partnering with Region 16 Comprehensive Center, which is serves 3 different states. And one of the folks in our fellowship is the City of Seattle, and they have a levy that comes into play every 5 years that comes up for a vote. The policy or the priorities for that levy typically get worked out behind closed doors by the professional lead of the city. So once the engagement kicks in, it's often a call to get feedback on a predetermined set of priorities. So instead, the leaders of the Department of Education and Early Learning are co-designing a process now for upstream influence. They're partnering with existing youth organizing groups, parent leadership teams, and community organizations who typically receive the funding. And they're doing it before everything gets set in stone, and having those conversations, having a set of conversations to shape some of those priorities. Some of you may already know Cadre in LA. They're kind of another example. Nearly 15 years ago now, they got the district to change its discipline policy. And that policy became a lever that enabled parents to go into schools to monitor and assess implementation. And when they did that, they realized that there wasn't any change actually happening on the ground, or very little change on the ground. And so they were still seeing the disproportionate push out, and the dynamics between especially Black parents and educators were as powered and problematic as they had been. So in some of the work they did with the FLDC, they worked to redesign moment-to-moment school discipline interactions and use them as opportunities for collective intervention and for learning to practice and to enact moments of solidarity, especially between Black and Brown parents. So policy that moves from platforms for voice to processes that center and build for the expertise and leadership of youth families and communities who've been systematically marginalized for school are kind of one set of conducive policy contexts. The second principle that I'm going to talk about is related to that, is transforming power. And over the decades, as you know, we have a lot of policy efforts to try to foster more shared decision-making and governance, especially at the local level. And one of the things that I think policymakers need to know is that structures alone are insufficient for transforming power. So we have a recognition that parents, especially parents of color, often have little power in relation to broader systems, to educators, professionals, degreed folks with formal titles. And as you know, in the 90s, we had a wave of reforms intended to structure local control through committees or councils at the school level. And the pendulum has swung back. In some ways, we've had more reforms and efforts, especially, for example, in California, focused on what does it mean to foster shared decision-making. But policymakers need to understand that structures alone aren't sufficient. And so if we go back to the 90s, we have studies of a number of different efforts to do this kind of local governance. And the history of participatory reforms makes it very clear that these efforts resulted in some of the same racialized outcomes and power dynamics that already exist. They often reproduce rather than challenge the institutional status quo. And even when participation is carefully orchestrated, he said, most often power and influence remains in the same hands. And I bet you can guess which hands those are. And then we see in 2022, not surprisingly, current day efforts are also resulting in yielded what they, Dharmala and her colleagues refer to as racist effects in implementation. So what does that mean? So we need to move from policy that is simply focused on structures to imagining earmarking resources for collective learning within and across groups, and that create time and space for families, parents, young people to learn from each other, to learn across different roles, and to reimagine beyond the system as it is. And I have to admit, the first time we kind of started talking about this, I as a kind of theory of change, it sounded very simplistic. And then I began to really think about how rarely this happens in schools and our current systems. And one of the things we actually did over time then is we looked at what happens when you give families, young people, educators, and others who are trying to support change in education, what happens when you give them that time and space to reimagine? And then how often the kinds of engagement structures and opportunities we have are kind of one-off. And so when in the absence of sustained engagements, we replicate the status quo over and over. So here, I'm going to just show you a quick snapshot of some data from FLDC. This is the Family Leadership Design Collaborative. Looked at 10 sets of design circles over at different sites in the country, different communities. Each of these design circles were 3 to 5 sessions. And design circles are kind of intensive working group. And it's the same or similar group of people over time. So we had about a total of 90 hours of transcripts, and we coded their implicit theories of change in their discussions. So not necessarily what they were doing, but their notions and theories of how to realize educational justice and community well-being. And one of the things that you'll see pretty quickly is that they change over time. And they change in particular kinds of ways. So we coded the kinds of theories of change they were talking about from, you can see there from, well, we just need to improve parenting, to thinking about like, how might we get different within systems change, for example, get more representatives on particular committees, kind of going back to this, the structure piece, and then people thinking about how could we reclaim these systems, and then seeing, we call this kind of the blue-purple shift, then beginning to see people imagine things beyond the current system, no longer centering the system in the kinds of ideas, possibilities, solutions that they were talking about and co-constructing conceptually. So really taking the time, recognizing that people need the time and space to build the relational conditions, though, to get to those theories of change, and to develop what Sepahar Vakil and others call politicized trust, to begin to take up solidarity dreaming practices that no longer center educational systems. So one example of this is some of the work they did in Salt Lake City, West Salt Lake City. In Utah, they mandate a certain number of parents on their school community councils, which are budget decision-making bodies at the school level. And as you probably can imagine, they had a very much a rubber stamp problem. The structure itself wasn't sufficient, especially Latinx and other immigrant and refugee families felt completely shut out of the process. And the funds were restricted to very particular kinds of things that were shaped around the school's agenda, preset agenda. And so they sat down and they got some time and space to reimagine what their school community councils could be, what are the contexts and relational conditions that they would need to create. And through this process, through their design circles, actually, eventually the legislature caught wind of that, and they were able to talk to the legislature about the way that they use those funds. They were able to change the law so that they could be used for time and space, for family engagement, for education, to support families and participating in the councils in ways that actually began to transform how power unfolded in those contexts. One other example coming from the Washington context, I mentioned the tribal consultation. So there's a smaller district in Washington called LaConner, and when they have this guidance that they're supposed to do tribal consultation, of course, there isn't a particular procedure for that. So they are co-designing with tribal communities, with families, with young people, what does it look like to undertake that process of tribal consultation in ways that are actually specific and culture responsive, and in kind of a reciprocal relationality with local tribes? Okay, so we need policy that does more than designate structures. It also enables on-the-ground shifts in power. And then we also need to think about, what does it mean to build reciprocity in agency? And that contrasts with that image that I showed earlier with the settled expectations of unilateral decisions and schooling done to children and family. And so as we think about that, we have like a lot of the focus and policy is often on young people or on families, and really trying to think about, what does it mean to focus especially on educators and educational leaders? So one of the things that policymakers need to know is that educators and leaders are not prepared or practicing with the current knowledge about learning. This is probably not new to a lot of you. I'm looking at Bill on the screen here. But I especially want to draw your attention to the field of the learning sciences, which frankly, I didn't know existed when I started teaching. And I'm getting up there, but there's plenty of folks still teaching in K-12. And the vast majority of educational leaders and administrators. So we have a field that's awash in all these politicized debates and arguments about what counts as science and evidence. Anything with the word brain in it gets people going. But we actually do have an entire field dedicated to how people learn. And yes, it's interdisciplinary. And it's grounded in the everyday, but we're not just dogs who salivate at the sound of a bell. We aren't brains walking around disconnected from bodies. But it's actually amazing how many of our dominant frameworks in education and many of the policies are founded on a set of assumptions that are out of touch with the latest understandings from the learning sciences. And as we think about the preparation of teachers and the preparation of leaders, which I'm certainly implicated in, I think we need to really think about the extent to which this body of knowledge that we built over the past 30 years is actually infused in the way that we are preparing and providing ongoing support for educators and leaders. So many of you are already familiar with this. I'm not going to spend time on it. And we've this notion of learning and culture as being integrally tied to each other, intertwined, is comes out of consensus work. But every day on the ground, I still hear educators refer to efforts to attend to culture as touchy-feely, as airy-fairy work that's not going to produce improved outcomes. The local newspaper, literally 2 days ago, kind of reinforce that kind of narrative. And we've had some amazing learning scientists who have put together things like the RISE principles. And I think that's one of the things, though, that those have not yet made their way through policies, through preparation at all these different levels. For us to really recognize that these one size can't fit all. It helps us really think about things like all of these debates swirling around right now about the science of reading and things like that. So this really matters, of course, because for a lot of different reasons. But if we think about our US teacher workforce, it's still over 80% white. And yes, we certainly need to continue to do grow your own and other HR recruitment and retention efforts. These are all important to continue to diversify the teacher workforce. And that's going to take decades. And it's often, and I think we might think about it as not sufficient given the latest learning sciences knowledge. So in order to realize those principles of learning, educators have to be able to partner with Indigenous and racially minoritized families, especially those who've been multiply marginalized. So those who are with children with disabilities, multilingual students, those living in poverty, experiencing homelessness, et cetera. So we need to move from a focus on building family capacity solely and family trainings to really thinking about policy that recognizes the entire system of educator preparation all the way up to systems leadership that is implicated in that school-centered model. We need stronger levers in our standards and evaluation systems for partnering with family. Actually, the first time I got to go to the White House, I stood up and told Arnie Duncan that our educator standards were weak levers for the kinds of shifts that we needed. Strangely enough, I never got invited back to talk about families under that administration. I'm keeping my eye on the time here, so I'm not going to go too far into this, but the national leadership standards have made some important shifts over the last few years. I want to just give an example of a program that I'm involved in, and just to kind of note here that when we are situating the core work of leadership, we don't have a kind of separate course on family engagement. It's not something that we're asking leaders to do for families, but it's actually for the core work of leading for educational justice. All right, so I'm going to move on to this last one, and this one actually is going to get the shortest shrift because we have other folks talking about these things in some of the other spaces. But I think that this is really crucial to undertaking change as collective inquiry, because any policy, any kind of reform effort, of course, has to actually be implemented in particular contexts, in particular communities, and we need to kind of co-design local solutions. So it means we have to grapple with data, and policymakers need to know, of course, they know measures matter, right? But they need to think about what kinds of measures matter, and to begin, and Jamal Bowman, I know, is on one of the other calls, to think about how do we begin to transform our system of measures away from the kind of weaponizing them against schools, against educators, against young people and families, and to begin to shift our entire orientation to what they're for and how to use them. So we've had last fall a gathering from across the country of folks actually called Measures That Matter, really trying to think with young people, families, communities about what does that mean? How might we humanize data for improvement? And how might we begin to develop what Thomas Phillips and his colleagues call critical racial data literacies? So how, beyond minimizing harm, do we begin to build these kinds of literacies as part of collective inquiry with measures that matter, that foster the kinds of aims and dreams that young people, families, and communities are prioritizing for themselves? There's more to say there, lots more to say there, but I just wanted to kind of signal that piece. And shout out Cycle. And this is not work I've been, well, it's work I've touched on, and Cycle has been part of the Measures That Matter and also FLDC work. They, in a number of different communities, are working with young people and families to come up with different kinds of indicators, and thinking about how to use those in improvement efforts and working in tandem with districts. So these are some of the policy contexts, I think, as I think about the different practices that we're trying to cultivate on the ground, really recognizing and building that Black and Brown influential presence, and recognizing the crucial expertise and centering that, going beyond structures and building time and space, really thinking about the preparation and ongoing learning of educators and leaders, and reorienting our relationship with data and measures towards collective inquiry. So I'm going to leave us with a final invitation. What if we focused on cultivating the conditions to realize the potential for Indigenous and racially minoritized youth, family, and community leadership? And so these are kind of three big ideas I'm going to leave us with, provocations, if you will, that we can hopefully talk about, that we might provide people with resources, time, space, and influence to reimagine education beyond the current status quo and collaborate in making change, that we might nurture leadership and educator practice to facilitate learning from and with youth and families. And of course, that implicates researchers and scholars as well. And then we might grow systems and capacity for developing using measures that matter to foster more just schools. Thank you so much. I'm excited and look forward to being in conversation with you.